In a wealthy family where everything seems perfect, what should have been a simple dinner turns into something much deeper. Tonight, Amara, a strong, confident, and talented black woman, is joining her husband, Thaddeus, for dinner at his mother's luxurious home, Mrs. Winslow. Although Thaddeus truly loves his wife, he's blind to the coldness in his mother's eyes and completely misses the subtle hints she keeps dropping. Deep down, Mrs. Winslow always hoped her son would marry Celeste, the daughter of an important business partner, someone she believes fits her idea of the perfect match. Can love help Amara rise above the coldness and prejudice coming from her mother-in-law? Follow the story to find out, and don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what happens next. That evening, Mrs. Winslow's home was bathed in a warm glow from the grand crystal chandeliers. The spacious house was elegantly decorated, with classic paintings lining the walls and luxurious brown leather sofas arranged with meticulous care. The air was quiet, except for the gentle clinking of silverware and dishes as dinner preparations were underway. Mrs. Winslow, a poised woman in her mid-50s, stood in the kitchen. She wore a pleasant smile, but there was no warmth in her eyes. She watched Amara closely, her daughter-in-law, whom she had never truly believed was worthy of her son. Amara stepped into the living room, a space that had become familiar, yet still made her feel out of place. Though she had been Thaddeus's wife for 6 months, she could never shake the feeling of being an outsider in this home. Everything here felt foreign to her. The fine porcelain dinnerware, the velvet-upholstered chairs, the quiet grandeur that seemed to whisper exclusivity and wealth. Thaddeus looked at her with pride in his eyes. He gently touched her shoulder and smiled. "You look beautiful," he said. "I'm so proud of you." Amara smiled faintly, but inside, unease twisted in her chest. No matter how deeply Thaddeus loved her, he never seemed to notice the tension that hovered around them, or the games his mother played so well. She walked toward the dining table, where Mrs. Winslow had laid out a grand feast, the dishes artfully arranged. The aroma filled the room, but to Amara, it felt stifling. Mrs. Winslow stood near the stove, smiling brightly at Thaddeus and Celeste, the family friend she always seemed to favor. When Amara entered, Mrs. Winslow cast her a quick glance, then turned away without a word of greeting. "Amara, how are you feeling? Still doing well?" Mrs. Winslow asked, her voice polite but cold. It was the kind of question asked out of obligation, not care, and Amara felt the chill in it. The contrast in tone compared to how she spoke to Celeste was stark. "I'm fine, thank you," Amara replied softly, trying to keep her voice calm, though the discomfort inside her grew. She knew Mrs. Winslow didn't like her, but she could never quite understand why. Was it because she didn't come from money? Or is it something deeper that Mrs. Winslow refused to say out loud? Mrs. Winslow gave her a tight smile and turned away, beginning to serve the food. Every move she made felt deliberate, as though each dish she placed on the table was a silent judgment. Amara could feel the disdain in the air, even if nothing was said outright. She couldn't help but watch the woman's face, where every flicker of her eyes, every restrained motion, spoke volumes. "Thaddeus, you love this dish, don't you?" Mrs. Winslow said sweetly, setting a platter in front of him. "It's one of my special recipes. You must try it." Her gaze, however, remained locked on Amara, and there was nothing warm about it. Her words, though directed at her son, felt like daggers aimed squarely at her daughter-in-law's heart. Amara took her seat, trying to appear composed, but she couldn't shake the growing tension in her chest. She reached for a spoon, but the food before her was suddenly unappetizing. The flavor wasn't unfamiliar, but in this atmosphere, it might as well have been poison. Thaddeus, oblivious to the silent battle at the table, chatted cheerfully with Celeste, laughing about old family vacations. Meanwhile, Amara sat in silence, feeling increasingly shut out, as if she were merely a guest in her own life. She glanced at Mrs. Winslow, who stole quick, sharp glances at her, only to look away when Amara met her gaze. The message was clear: she didn't belong here. "Amara, try this," Thaddeus said, offering her a warm smile. Mom worked really hard on it. He didn't notice the tension, the chill in the air. Amara gave him a weak smile, took a small bite, and immediately regretted it. The taste seemed to turn in her mouth. She couldn't take another bite. As the dinner conversation carried on without her, a wave of nausea rose in Amara's stomach. She tried to breathe evenly, but the room began to blur. All she could feel was the weight of Mrs. Winslow's presence, a presence that had never welcomed her. This dinner was never going to be what she had hoped. It wasn't a family gathering, it was a quiet war. Dinner continued under a veil of tension. Amara forced herself to swallow each bite, even though nothing tasted right. Conversation flowed around her, but she felt like a stranger at the table. Thaddeus kept asking about her work, about recent trips they had taken, but she couldn't focus. Every glance from Mrs. Winslow, every subtle look, made Amara feel like she was under constant surveillance. She couldn't tell if Mrs. Winslow truly cared about her, or if it was all just for show. She didn't understand why, but the discomfort kept building inside her. From a moment she stepped into Mrs. Winslow's home that evening, Amara had sensed the coolness in her mother-in-law's gaze. Mrs. Winslow never greeted her the way she did Celeste, the beloved family friend. Amara always felt like the outsider at these dinners, as if Mrs. Winslow had a reason she was never willing to say out loud for why she refused to accept her. The older woman made no real effort to engage her. She would simply pass by, focusing her attention on everyone else. When dinner came to an end, Amara quietly stood up to help clear the table. A wave of nausea rose in her chest, but she held it in. As she moved between the dining room and the kitchen, Mrs. Winslow and Celeste remained seated, laughing and chatting comfortably, as if Amara wasn't even there. She felt like a shadow in a house that should have felt like her own. Thaddeus walked over and smiled sweetly at her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. She managed to smile back, but her heart felt heavier than ever. Then Mrs. Winslow stood up and walked over, her sharp eyes scanning Amara's face. "Amara, you didn't eat much tonight," she said with a sugar-sweet tone that held something sharper underneath. Amara didn't answer. She looked at Mrs. Winslow for a moment, then quietly continued cleaning. Mrs. Winslow raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. A little while later, Thaddeus stepped beside Amara and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay? Did my mom say something that upset you?" he asked. Amara simply shook her head, trying to hide the emotions swirling inside. She didn't want to worry him, but one question wouldn't leave her mind. Why does your mother hate me so much? Why did Mrs. Winslow dislike her? Amara had done everything she could to fit in, to show love and respect for Thaddeus's family. She had loved him wholeheartedly, and she knew he loved her in return. But his mother had never accepted her, not from the very beginning. The cold stares, the passive-aggressive comments, all of it felt like an attempt to quietly push her away. No matter how hard she tried to prove herself, it never seemed to be enough. She remembered the first time she met Mrs. Winslow. The woman had looked her up and down with a scrutinizing gaze. "And who are you?" she had asked, her voice cold as winter air. Amara had never forgotten that look, as if Mrs. Winslow had been waiting for a reason to disapprove of her. She hadn't asked about Amara's background or her accomplishments, just a string of pointed questions, as if she were someone not worth knowing. And in later conversations, Mrs. Winslow would only ask about Amara's family, not out of interest, but to subtly highlight how different they were, how less than they were compared to the Winslows. Amara knew then. Mrs. Winslow had always wanted her son to marry someone who met the family standards, and she simply didn't fit those standards. Amara was a black woman from a modest background, far from the upper-class circles the Winslow family lived in. Mrs. Winslow, with her conservative values and obsession with image, couldn't accept the idea of her only son loving someone who didn't match her carefully constructed world. To her, Amara was unworthy of Thaddeus's affection. Every attempt to prove her love, her sincerity, her loyalty, none of it had ever been enough. But it wasn't just about Amara being an outsider. It was also about the expectations Mrs. Winslow had placed on her son. Thaddeus was the family's only heir, the one who would inherit the fortune, the legacy, the reputation. And Mrs. Winslow wasn't going to let anyone get in the way of that. Amara, with her quiet grace and genuine love, simply didn't match the picture his mother had painted of who should stand beside him. Every dinner at Mrs. Winslow's house had become a silent battle. Amara fought to keep her dignity, her composure, while fending off judgmental looks and subtle jabs. Still, she endured for Thaddeus. He was the one person she truly loved and wanted to build a future with. She believed that, one day, the truth would come to light, and when it did, Mrs. Winslow would have no choice but to face it. Dinner ended in a silence that was hard to describe. Amara tried to stay composed, even though inside, she felt as though everything was falling apart. Frustration and unease clung to her as Mrs. Winslow rose from her seat and walked toward her. Once again, Amara could sense that familiar disapproval. The way Mrs. Winslow constantly ignored her, dismissed her presence, or glanced at her with subtle suspicion had become all too familiar. Thaddeus still didn't notice the tension that had thickened the evening air. He remained blissfully unaware, chatting with Celeste, the family's longtime friend, about trips they had taken together in the past. Every one of Celeste's cheerful stories, every compliment Mrs. Winslow gave her, felt like an arrow striking Amara's heart. She tried to smile, but the loneliness and isolation only grew heavier. Celeste, beautiful, polished, effortlessly charming, never lacked attention. Her golden hair shimmered under the soft lighting, her radiant smile drawing everyone in. No matter how warm Amara tried to be, in Mrs. Winslow's eyes, Celeste was the perfect match for her son. She was everything Mrs. Winslow admired: poised, socially compatible, and the kind of woman who could elevate the family status. The way Mrs. Winslow looked at her, almost longingly, made that painfully clear. Mrs. Winslow knew that replacing Amara with Celeste would unlock an opportunity she had long been pursuing. A major real estate project, one involving the acquisition of a valuable property that could become a high-end shopping district, had recently come into play. It was a chance to grow the family's wealth and influence, and Mrs. Winslow believed that Celeste, with her connections and sophistication, was the key to sealing the deal. After all, she had raised Celeste almost like a daughter. Amara wasn't without value, but she didn't belong to the world Mrs. Winslow was trying to preserve. She was independent, strong, and intelligent, but her background, humble and distant from high society, made Mrs. Winslow uneasy. In her eyes, Amara couldn't enhance the family's name or assets. She was merely a chapter in Thaddeus's life. And if she couldn't help the Winslow family climb higher, she had no place in it at all. Mrs. Winslow had a long-term plan. She would slowly create a space in which Amara felt she didn't belong, pushing her toward leaving on her own. Every visit, every dinner, she crafted situations where Amara would feel like an outsider, where the contrast with Celeste was impossible to ignore. The pointed questions about Amara's family, the subtle digs at her background, none of it was accidental. Mrs. Winslow was building a wall between Amara and the family brick by brick. But Amara didn't see the bigger picture yet. She still believed that her love for Thaddeus would be enough to carry them through. She believed that sincerity and patience could overcome any resentment. But Mrs. Winslow didn't see it that way. She knew love wasn't always enough, especially when it stood in the way of wealth and power. One afternoon, when Thaddeus and Celeste had left for a meeting, Mrs. Winslow asked Amara to stay behind. "Amara," she began, her tone gentle, but laced with something sharper, "do you truly believe you're the right fit for the life we're building? Thaddeus loves you, yes. But do you believe you can contribute to this family the way Celeste could?" Amara, unsure of the full weight of the question, responded calmly but confidently, "I love Thaddeus, and I want to do everything I can to keep this family happy." Mrs. Winslow paused, as if reflecting on her next move. Then she spoke, her voice still soft but deliberate. "That's good to hear. But Amara, don't forget, love isn't always enough in this world. What you bring to the table matters, too. Her words carried the weight of a warning, though Amara didn't yet understand their full meaning. She assumed Mrs. Winslow was merely concerned about the family's future, and she was determined to try harder. What she didn't know was that Mrs. Winslow had already made up her mind. She wanted Amara gone, and Celeste in her place. And so began a quiet war. One Amara had no idea was being waged. Mrs. Winslow had laid out every step carefully. And soon, Amara would have to face the cruel truth that Thaddeus's love might not be enough to protect her from the calculated schemes of a mother who valued legacy and control above all else. The tension grew heavier each time Amara stepped into Mrs. Winslow's house. Family dinners were no longer warm, joyful gatherings. They had become quiet battlegrounds that she couldn't escape. Every invitation to dine felt less like a gesture of family and more like another reminder that she didn't belong. She didn't understand why, but Mrs. Winslow always seemed to find subtle ways to make her feel unworthy. Tonight's dinner felt especially suffocating. Thaddeus was absent, away for an important meeting, leaving Amara alone with Mrs. Winslow and Celeste. When Amara walked into the living room, Mrs. Winslow didn't even look up. She continued arranging the dishes on the table with graceful but deliberate hands. Celeste, dressed in a striking red dress, was already seated on the couch across from her. She smiled and greeted Amara, but there was a glint of sarcasm in her eyes that made Amara uncomfortable. Amara, you look lovely tonight, Celeste said sweetly, her voice polished. But Amara could tell it was nothing more than small talk. She forced a polite smile, unsure how to respond. Mrs. Winslow finally looked up, her expression icy. Would you have a seat? Dinner is ready. Amara nodded and made her way to the chair at the head of the table, doing her best to stay composed. She was used to the coldness by now, but tonight it felt even sharper. She told herself not to let it get to her. But when Mrs. Winslow began discussing her travels with Celeste, recounting stories from high society events they'd attended together, it felt like a blade slicing through Amara's chest. She didn't exist in those stories. She never did. Amara, what do you think? Mrs. Winslow asked, her voice sweet but edged. I actually think events like those would help you grow a lot. We need stronger connections in this society. Celeste, as everyone knows, is welcome everywhere. Amara looked up, unsure of what Mrs. Winslow was implying. The older woman continued in her usual calm but cutting tone. You're a good person, Amara. But if you want to be fully accepted into this family, maybe you should learn from someone like Celeste. She knows how to thrive in a world like this. The words hit Amara like a cold wave. She glanced at Celeste, who sat quietly, her eyes glinting with smug satisfaction. Amara couldn't take it anymore. She stood up, locking eyes with Mrs. Winslow. Why don't you just say it? You don't want me here, do you? The room fell silent. Mrs. Winslow slowly set down the silverware in her hands and turned to Amara, her gaze sharp. You're being too sensitive, Amara, she replied. Everything I say is for the good of this family. Don't forget, Thaddeus is our only heir, and I won't watch him end up with someone who can't help him rise in this world. Amara's heart sank. She had always believed that love could change things, that her sincerity could break down walls. But now, Mrs. Winslow's words shattered every hope she'd held. It wasn't just about disapproval, it was about control. She didn't just dislike Amara, she wanted her out of the family. You want Celeste to replace me, don't you? Amara said, unable to hold back the anger swelling inside her. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned. Mrs. Winslow didn't respond right away. She calmly took a sip of her wine, then set the glass down. If you can't see that, there's nothing more to say. But I think you already know. She smiled faintly, a look filled with hidden meaning. To Amara, it felt like she had just been pushed out of a game she never stood a chance of winning. Celeste couldn't help herself. A satisfied smile spread across her face. Did you really think you'd always be the only one, Amara? Your mother-in-law just told you what you didn't want to admit. Sometimes, love isn't enough to meet society's expectations. Celeste's words struck like a dagger. As painful as they were, they rang with uncomfortable truth. Amara couldn't deny it. Mrs. Winslow never accepted her. They didn't want someone like her. They wanted someone like Celeste. Someone who could offer advantages. Someone who could elevate the family name in elite circles. At that moment, Amara felt like she stood at a crossroads. She could walk away, let Celeste take her place, or she could face the harsh truth and fight to stand her ground. A wave of helplessness rose in her, but deep down, she knew she wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Thaddeus hadn't come home. But when he did, nothing would be the same. The cracks in the family were no longer hidden. The tension had built to a breaking point. Amara had a decision to make. Was she strong enough to stand against not just her calculating mother-in-law, but the woman who had been hiding in plain sight as her husband's closest friend? In the days following the tense confrontation, Amara couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. She didn't understand why Mrs. Winslow treated her this way, but the coldness and sharp looks haunted her mind. Every time she encountered Mrs. Winslow, it felt as though she was being watched. Every gesture, every move scrutinized. And the more she reflected, the more she realized that Mrs. Winslow wasn't just rejecting her. She was actively trying to push her out of this family. Fatigue and disappointment steadily built up in Amara. She had tried so hard to integrate, to build a meaningful relationship with Thaddeus's family. But perhaps all her efforts had been in vain. Each time she thought things might improve, something would happen that made her feel like an outsider. It seemed Mrs. Winslow would never allow her to be part of the family. One afternoon, with Thaddeus away on business, Amara decided she wouldn't just sit in silence any longer. She knew she needed to understand more about the situation she was in. She had heard rumors about Mrs. Winslow's secret meetings with business partners, whispers of how the family was trying to connect with more influential people to maintain their status. While she had no concrete proof, something felt off. As Mrs. Winslow left for a charity event, Amara decided to try again. But this time, she wouldn't just look for small signs. She wanted to know exactly what Mrs. Winslow thought of her and the family. She stood up and walked over to Mrs. Winslow's desk, where the older woman kept important documents. Amara had seen her place papers in the drawer before, and today, she decided to open it. When Amara opened the drawer, she didn't find anything immediately suspicious, just a few folders and paperwork related to Mrs. Winslow's work. But one thing caught her eye, a thick, carefully folded letter. She opened it and found that it was a copy of an email conversation between Mrs. Winslow and a prominent investor. The words in the letter were not just about business negotiations, but hinted at something much deeper, an ongoing plan to merge the two families to increase their influence in society. The more Amara read, the more she felt stunned. Celeste is the ideal choice. She can help our family raise its position in society. Amara may be a good girl, but she isn't the one who can help us build long-term, meaningful connections. To make the Winslow family strong, we need to align with people who can help us climb higher. Amara gasped for air, the words striking her like a knife to the heart. This was why Mrs. Winslow didn't like her. She didn't see her as part of the family. She saw her as an obstacle in the way of the family's advancement. What Mrs. Winslow wanted, in reality, was a marriage that could bring more benefits than true love. Amara couldn't stay in that room any longer. The chaotic thoughts in her head made her feel exhausted. She stood up, intending to leave when, suddenly, the door opened. Thaddeus stood at the threshold, stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't speak at first, just stared at the letter in Amara's hands. She didn't know what to say. Fear gripped her heart. "Amara, what are you doing in here?" Thaddeus asked, his voice low, a hint of tension in it. Amara looked at him, her chest heavy with confusion and disappointment. "You need to see this, Thaddeus. Your mother, she's not just cold to me. She wants me to leave this family so Celeste can take my place." She placed the letter on the table, her hands trembling. Thaddeus stood frozen, his eyes wide, unable to believe what he was hearing. He looked at the letter and then back at Amara, as if he couldn't comprehend what she was saying. Silence filled the room, and in that moment, Amara felt as though the truth was tearing everything apart. "Do you think so? Your mother wants me gone because she thinks I'm not good enough for this family, right?" She continued, her voice breaking with emotion, unable to hold back anymore. Thaddeus stood there, quietly looking at her, his expression changing. He didn't speak right away, but stared down at the letter. He felt dazed. Everything was beginning to make sense, and in that instant, he realized that he had been blindly trusting his mother, not seeing the reality of the situation. His world had been turned upside down. "No, it's not like that. I don't know." Thaddeus stammered, his voice weak, as if everything around him had lost its clarity. Amara's heart broke. She hadn't wanted to do this, but she had no choice. She had seen the truth, and now she had to face it, no matter how painful it was. "You need to confront your mother, Thaddeus. If not, we won't have a future." Her words were like a declaration of war. She was tired of living in the shadows, under the thumb of a controlling mother-in-law. And Thaddeus, though still confused, realized he couldn't continue living in the lie. Confronting Mrs. Winslow had become inevitable. But would Thaddeus have the courage to stand by Amara and protect his family, or would he continue to follow his mother's plans? In the days following the tense confrontation, Amara couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. She didn't understand why Mrs. Winslow treated her this way, but the coldness and sharp looks haunted her mind. Every time she encountered Mrs. Winslow, it felt as though she was being watched. Every gesture, every move scrutinized. And the more she reflected, the more she realized that Mrs. Winslow wasn't just rejecting her. She was actively trying to push her out of this family. Fatigue and disappointment steadily built up in Amara. She had tried so hard to integrate, to build a meaningful relationship with Thaddeus's family. But perhaps all her efforts had been in vain. Each time she thought things might improve, something would happen that made her feel like an outsider. It seemed Mrs. Winslow would never allow her to be part of the family. One afternoon, with Thaddeus away on business, Amara decided she wouldn't just sit in silence any longer. She knew she needed to understand more about the situation she was in. She had heard rumors about Mrs. Winslow's secret meetings with business partners, whispers of how the family was trying to connect with more influential people to maintain their status. While she had no concrete proof, something felt off. As Mrs. Winslow left for a charity event, Amara decided to try again. But this time, she wouldn't just look for small signs. She wanted to know exactly what Mrs. Winslow thought of her and the family. She stood up and walked over to Mrs. Winslow's desk, where the older woman kept important documents. Amara had seen her place papers in the drawer before, and today, she decided to open it. When Amara opened the drawer, she didn't find anything immediately suspicious, just a few folders and paperwork related to Mrs. Winslow's work. But one thing caught her eye, a thick, carefully folded letter. She opened it and found that it was a copy of an email conversation between Mrs. Winslow and a prominent investor. The words in the letter were not just about business negotiations, but hinted at something much deeper, an ongoing plan to merge the two families to increase their influence in society. The more Amara read, the more she felt stunned. Celeste is the ideal choice. She can help our family raise its position in society. Amara may be a good girl, but she isn't the one who can help us build long-term, meaningful connections. To make the Winslow family strong, we need to align with people who can help us climb higher. Amara gasped for air, the words striking her like a knife to the heart. This was why Mrs. Winslow didn't like her. She didn't see her as part of the family. She saw her as an obstacle in the way of the family's advancement. What Mrs. Winslow wanted, in reality, was a marriage that could bring more benefits than true love. Amara couldn't stay in that room any longer. The chaotic thoughts in her head made her feel exhausted. She stood up, intending to leave when, suddenly, the door opened. Thaddeus stood at the threshold, stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't speak at first, just stared at the letter in Amara's hands. She didn't know what to say. Fear gripped her heart. "Amara, what are you doing in here?" Thaddeus asked, his voice low, a hint of tension in it. Amara looked at him, her chest heavy with confusion and disappointment. "You need to see this, Thaddeus. Your mother, she's not just cold to me. She wants me to leave this family so Celeste can take my place." She placed the letter on the table, her hands trembling. Thaddeus stood frozen, his eyes wide, unable to believe what he was hearing. He looked at the letter and then back at Amara, as if he couldn't comprehend what she was saying. Silence filled the room, and in that moment, Amara felt as though the truth was tearing everything apart. "Do you think so? Your mother wants me gone because she thinks I'm not good enough for this family, right?" She continued, her voice breaking with emotion, unable to hold back anymore. Thaddeus stood there, quietly looking at her, his expression changing. He didn't speak right away, but stared down at the letter. He felt dazed. Everything was beginning to make sense, and in that instant, he realized that he had been blindly trusting his mother, not seeing the reality of the situation. His world had been turned upside down. "No, it's not like that. I don't know." Thaddeus stammered, his voice weak, as if everything around him had lost its clarity. Amara's heart broke. She hadn't wanted to do this, but she had no choice. She had seen the truth, and now she had to face it, no matter how painful it was. "You need to confront your mother, Thaddeus. If not, we won't have a future." Her words were like a declaration of war. She was tired of living in the shadows, under the thumb of a controlling mother-in-law. And Thaddeus, though still confused, realized he couldn't continue living in the lie. Confronting Mrs. Winslow had become inevitable. But would Thaddeus have the courage to stand by Amara and protect his family, or would he continue to follow his mother's plans? The next day, Thaddeus couldn't sleep. The things Amara had said, the evidence she presented, all of it made it impossible for him to continue living in ambiguity and denial. He couldn't believe that his mother was capable of such actions, yet he couldn't dismiss the undeniable truth before him. He looked at the photos Amara had taken, at the lines in Mrs. Winslow's notebook, and it felt like a wall had come crashing down, leaving a hollow space inside him. Thaddeus didn't know who to trust anymore, didn't know what was real or what was genuine emotion. He had loved his mother so deeply, and she, despite her misguided actions and thoughts, had always been his guiding figure throughout his life. But now, the truth forced him to choose between the mother he had revered and the wife he loved. A painful decision he never thought would come so soon. Thaddeus stood in front of the mirror, looking at his tired face, his eyes reflecting a mixture of anger and sorrow. He couldn't help but feel angry at his mother for manipulating his feelings, but he also couldn't help but feel disappointed in himself for allowing her to control so much of his life. He had loved Amara with all his heart, but now he wondered if he had the courage to face the mother he had always looked up to. Could he stand firm to protect his wife, or would he choose to go back to the family where he had been taught to sacrifice everything? When he walked into the living room, where Amara sat quietly, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Amara looked at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion, but still determined. "Thaddeus, I don't want you to have to choose between your mother and me. I don't want to cause you pain, but I can't keep standing on the sidelines. I need you to stand by me, like you promised, through both the happy moments and the painful ones." Thaddeus sat down across from her, silence hanging in the air for a long moment before he spoke. "I cannot feel hurt, Amara. My mother, she's always been the one person I trusted, the one who built everything I have. But I can't deny the truth you've shown me. I never saw her as someone who could be wrong." Amara took his hand, her gaze full of understanding. "You can't change your past, but you can change our future. We can walk our own path together. I believe we can get through anything as long as we're always together." Thaddeus looked at Amara, realizing the strength and unconditional love she had for him. He felt a sense of relief, as if a part of him had been set free. He had lived so long under the shadow of his mother's expectations, but now he understood that true love wasn't about blind sacrifice. It was about companionship, sharing, and understanding each other. "I am sorry, Amara. I didn't see things clearly, but I promise I won't let this happen again. I will protect you, and I will always be by your side, no matter what my mother thinks." From that moment on, Thaddeus and Amara decided they would no longer endure the suffocating grip of family expectations. They didn't want to live under control, and they didn't want to choose between love and family. It was a difficult decision, but it was necessary for them to find true freedom and happiness. Thaddeus decided he would meet with his mother, face her, and make his feelings clear. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also understood that if he didn't, his relationship with Amara wouldn't survive. He wanted Mrs. Winslow to know that he had grown and that he had the right to decide his own life. The meeting between Thaddeus and Mrs. Winslow took place in a tense atmosphere. Thaddeus sat across from his mother, no longer with the blind admiration he had once felt. "Mom, I know everything. I've read what you wrote about Amara and Celeste. I can't accept what you've done." Mrs. Winslow sat in silence, saying nothing, but the wrinkles on her face seemed to tighten as though she were searching for an explanation. "You don't understand, son. I just want you to have a secure future, a strong family," she said, her voice no longer filled with arrogance, but tinged with sadness. "I know you want what's best for me, but you can't control my life anymore. I've grown up, and I have Amara. We'll build our future together, not live according to what you've planned for me." Thaddeus spoke with a determination that even he hadn't known he possessed. Mrs. Winslow fell silent, and a deep sorrow passed through her eyes. "You don't understand, but I won't stop you. If you choose her, you'll have to live with the consequences of that choice." Thaddeus stood up, no longer filled with doubt or anxiety. He knew that, whether Mrs. Winslow accepted it or not, he had found clarity in his heart. He looked at her one last time and said, "Mom, I'll always love you, but I'll also always protect Amara. I hope you'll understand." When Thaddeus returned to Amara, he felt lighter than he had in a long time. The two of them embraced, not saying a word, but in that moment, they knew they had crossed a difficult bridge. The love and understanding they shared had given them strength. The world may be hard, but as long as they had each other, they could face anything. After the intense confrontation between Thaddeus and Mrs. Winslow, their family was never the same. The underlying conflicts, misunderstandings, and societal pressures seemed to have erupted, forcing everyone to reflect on themselves and their relationships. Thaddeus no longer saw himself as the small son in Mrs. Winslow's family. He was a grown man, one who knew how to stand up for what he loved. And in that moment, he realized something crucial. True love is not blind sacrifice, but respect, companionship, and mutual trust. Amara, though she had endured so much disdain from Mrs. Winslow and society, never once faltered. Every time she thought about the words and glances filled with discrimination she faced, she only felt herself growing stronger. She didn't just love Thaddeus, she loved his family and all that they could build together. But to truly have understanding and love, she had to fight, not just against Mrs. Winslow, but against the prejudices society had imposed on her for so many years. Since the day Thaddeus and Amara faced the truth, everything had changed. They no longer lived in the shadow of societal expectations, nor were they driven by racial prejudices. In fact, even though they had won the battle with Mrs. Winslow, many challenges still lay ahead. But with love and determination in their hearts, they were ready to continue walking forward, hand in hand. Months later, Amara received a call from an international charity organization, inviting her to join a major project aimed at helping the Black communities in underserved areas. This was a huge opportunity, not just for her, but for Thaddeus as well, as they could help others while proving that love and resilience could change the world. Thaddeus, despite having a stable job and a promising future, decided to join Amara. He knew that this work would not only change their lives, but also help build a strong community where people could see that a person's worth wasn't defined by their skin color or background. When Amara and Thaddeus informed Mrs. Winslow of their decision, she didn't protest as she had in the past. After much inner struggle, Mrs. Winslow finally accepted that her son was no longer a child she could control. In those moments, she realized that a son's love was not something she could control or change. She said nothing, just quietly looked at them and then softly said, "I hope you and Amara will find your way, no matter how difficult that path may be." Though it wasn't a full acceptance, it marked a significant shift in her heart. The family, from Mrs. Winslow to Celeste, began to see Amara in a different light. The racial prejudices and discrimination no longer dominated their conversations. Though the road to change was not always easy, at least they had begun to change how they viewed a black woman. Not through her appearance or where she came from, but through what she had done and contributed to society. Amara was not just a black woman. She was a strong wife, a loyal companion, and most importantly, a person with a heart full of love. The relationship between Amara and Thaddeus also grew deeper. They didn't just love each other. They were teammates, overcoming difficulties and challenges together. Their love wasn't built only on happy moments, but also on painful times and mutual understanding. Together, they proved that love could overcome societal prejudices, racial barriers, and class divisions. When they attended meetings and discussions with families and charities, others began to realize that Amara and Thaddeus' story wasn't just a simple tale of love overcoming adversity, but a story about changing perceptions and breaking down the barriers society had set up. Gradually, people no longer saw Amara through the lens of her skin color, but through her contributions and what she had done for the community. She became an inspiration to many, especially to other black individuals who had always felt forgotten and overlooked by society. Amara's story gave them hope that one day, racial discrimination would cease to exist, and everyone, regardless of color or origin, could stand equal, loved, and respected. Amara and Thaddeus became role models for families struggling with societal prejudices. They proved that true love was not something distant, but something attainable when both partners put in the effort, fighting for each other and for the values that truly mattered. And with each step they took, they created a life full of love, not just for themselves, but for everyone they encountered. Their story, from a tense confrontation to a hopeful ending, was proof of the power of love, determination, and the ability to change the perspective of an entire community. From that point on, the love between Amara and Thaddeus spread, not just in their family, but throughout society, becoming a source of inspiration for all those fighting for equality and justice. They didn't just build a family. They built a world where love and understanding would triumph over everything.